This is mostly what we're going to be talking about. This, I'm sure, is familiar to both of you. This is the actual Dewdrop app. So there are a few components at play here that we're going to talk about, and they hit different parts of the Dewdrop stack. So let's go over all four real quick, and then we'll dive into the code. So the overall Chrome for the application, so the main nav, the header nav and search bar up here, that's all contained in a layout script. And in this case, the layout script is assigned to the admin engine for Dewdrop. By layout script, I mean that it's responsible for all that Chrome. So it surrounds the page content and it's rendered actually after the page. So it's part of a pattern called two-step view. And in a two-step view, you've got your page-specific view script that gets rendered, and then all of the content that was generated gets passed along to a second view script that renders the Chrome or the layout. This allows you to do things like, queue up JavaScript and CSS and all of that to be added later, and then put all at the footer or whatever you might want to do. The next step is the page view script itself. That's everything in this white box here. So it includes the quick view, the recent activity, the three bubbles, all that stuff. The third area where you might have front-end markup in a Dewdrop app is in a partial view script. So just a kind of sub view script that you pass a subset of your information on the page to. And these three bubbles are all rendered by the same partial. So there's I think it's a bubblestat.phtml that receives a few variables for the titles, this number and this number, but otherwise the code is shared between these three. And then the final place where you might put front-end code in the Dewdrop app is a view helper. And that's a more reusable type of component that you would use across many different pages. And you also want a more defined API for. And in this case, the section that we're seeing up top here, so quick view with this create button and this bottom border, that is all in a view helper. So we're going to look at examples of all four of those types of components in Dewdrop and how you would use them. We're going to start again with the layout script. So if I look in admin view scripts, see the admin.phtml, and then there are several smaller scripts that I took directly from Nicholas's original implementation. So these came straight in, took very few changes other than the file name change. To put this custom layout in place, you'd be looking in your Bootstrap. So this defines, what is the admin area for this application? Using the Silex admin. Silex is a PHP framework you don't really need to know much about for front-end stuff. And this is the key part. We're just saying my layout is in this folder and my layout's file name is admin.phtml. So that's pointing us over to this area. Obviously, not a whole lot to the script itself. You can see I'm just doing basic requires here, which is going to be different than the partials that we'll look at a little later. Again, this is all pretty straightforward. I'm just doing the straight CSS and JavaScript includes as they were in the original implementation, nothing special there at all. I did switch from include to require. Very, very minor difference. The only change there is if the file was mistyped, an include would just generate what's called a warning in PHP, which typically is logged silently and just kind of goes away. Whereas a require would generate an error, so it would crash the page. And we would rather crash the page immediately and have something very predictable and obvious instead of that silent thing happening in the background. So kind of minor philosophical difference, but that's the only change I really made in these scripts. Ultimately, there will be one addition to this layout file that I didn't put in here yet, and that is including the dynamically created CSS and JavaScript references. So in the case of CSS, it would just be that. So I'm echoing the HeadLink view helper. That is going to spit out any CSS references that have been queued up by the page view script or by a view helper or anything like that that's been used to render the page. Very similarly, on the JavaScript side, beneath this stuff, you do echo this HeadScript. And again, any dynamic page-specific scripts would be spit out at that point. So that's layouts. You very rarely have to interact with them. You know. Yeah, what's up?
The helper where we would add in JavaScript files and CSS files if needed, those are in the view directory there, or that helper file. Is that what we would
the
edit?
helper itself, or
Yeah.
So these helpers are built in to Dewdrop, the HeadScript and HeadLink. And actually, now that I think about it, these ones are coming straight from Zend Framework. But the ones that are built into Dewdrop are coming out of Composer here. So we go view helper. So these are the core ones here. And then on a per project basis, you'll typically see a separate folder that has project specific view helpers. Like I said, in the case of HeadScript and HeadLink, those are actually the only two we just take straight from Zend Framework. We didn't need any changes on those. So if we go in here, this is HeadLink, for example. Looking at the code for HeadLink and HeadScript directly might not be the most useful thing in the world because they do some tricky stuff. But the ZF2 documentation for them will tell you all the different methods. I would say this is 90% of the things that I call on HeadLink is append style sheet. But you can see you can also do prepend, or you can say, I need to put this in the specific spot. So, you know, in spot 3, I'm going to put this style sheet instead of the one that's currently there. HeadScript is very similar. I believe it's append file in HeadScript. And we'll see some examples of these, so you don't have to remember all of this. But yeah, this is the set of methods for HeadScript. And like I said, append file is pretty much always what I'm actually doing there. So yeah, that's those helpers. Did that answer your question?
I think I was asking more where, like, if we needed to add in a new CSS file, like where exactly? I guess it would be that append file, or
yeah.
what was the other one, the style sheet?
That's append style sheet, and you could do that at any level. It depends on how specific the thing is. So if it's page specific, you could do that in your pages view script, which is the next thing we'll look at. So in the case of this index page that we're on right now, we've got our own view script here. And I could do a head link at this point, so append style sheet. And that would add it to that queue for me. Like I was showing in this documentation here, the typical attributes that you might play with are available to you. So you could say it's print only or it's screen only. You can do conditional comments. So it has to be IE9 or less, whatever it might be. So relatively straightforward to work with. 90% of my calls to it look exactly like that. Nothing tricky about them. So this is the specific page that I'm working with right now. And there's a lot of this that'll look unfamiliar at first. The most important thing to realize is you can just do straight HTML if you want to. I don't have to use partials like I am here, and I don't have to use this view helper like I am here. Those are conveniences or ways to reuse snippets of markup in a more readable way. But ultimately, you can just write HTML. That's totally fine. When you are writing HTML, obviously you have to think about cross-site scripting and things like that, and we'll go over how you address those concerns in Dewdrop. But one of the big goals of the front-end aspects of Dewdrop is that a front-end developer should be able to come in here and, not knowing any other APIs, just write some markup and have it work. So that is something that's always available to you. If the view helpers that are built into Dewdrop are more of a hindrance than a help in achieving your design, you can just write some HTML. So that being said, let's look at how this is actually structured. And we're going to start with these partials. So again, these are the 3 bubbles on the main dashboard screen. Obviously, they share a lot of commonality in their markup, but the content is varying for each one. So to pull that off, we use a partial. And the difference between using a partial and just saying require in a file name is that you can give it a more constrained scope. So in this case, ultimately, this page is probably going to have a big chunk of data to render this recent activity. It's going to be a bunch of records from some model layer function. And then there might be some other data on here, like the current user and things like that. In the case of the partial, you don't need any of that. It only needs access to these 6 pieces of information. So you can explicitly do that, give it that limited amount of information. And that just makes it a little bit more comprehensible, because I know, looking at this call, that these are the only things that are going to come into play. There's nothing else involved in whatever bubblestat.phtml is. Once I open bubblestat.phtml, I see, okay, it's just more HTML. There's nothing at all complicated going on in this file. The concept that has been introduced here, like I was talking about before, is handling of cross-site scripting concerns. So you can see that I'm taking the variables that were passed in, and depending upon the context in which they're used, I'm using a specific escaping call to address cross-site scripting. So in this case, I'm in an attribute value, so I do escape HTML adder. In this case, I'm outside of an HTML tag. I'm just in a text node, essentially. So I just say escape HTML. These methods that I'm using to address cross-site scripting concerns are from the Zend Escaper API. So that's another case where the Zend framework documentation tells you everything you need to know. So if I go ZF2 Escaper, here is let's go to the overall, overall Escaper documentation here. So you've got a few different methods available to you: escape HTML, HTML adder, JavaScript, CSS, and URLs. So for all of those contexts, there's an escaper method available for you. By far, the most commonly used are HTML and HTML adder, just like in WordPress. Those are probably the most common things to use. There is one addition that we make in Dewdrop itself that's worth being aware of. I don't know if you guys would hit this, but a lot of developers aren't aware of this concern. When you're in a view, we also provide this method, encode JSON HTML safe. And that is just going to call JSON encode with all of these additional flags. And what those flags do is they escape additional characters, so that when your JSON is spit out into an inline script block in your HTML, it's still safe. You're not going to have cross-site scripting. JSON encode out of the box doesn't do that. So if you're ever putting some JSON at the bottom of a file, for example, to make the initial load faster, that's worth being aware of. I'll show one quick example of that from another project. If we go to Process the Basics, which is a project we did a couple of years ago, one of the components here includes some JSON values at the bottom of the page. So these are going to be available as soon as my backbone code is loaded up, instead of having to do a separate AJAX call to get these blobs of JSON. So when I'm putting that out in my inline script block here, I want to make sure I call that encode JSON HTML safe so that that's taken care of. So that partial, we had this bubble stat partial, shows you an example of doing that kind of escaping. It's like most templating environments, you just kind of have to set something aside and say, this is data, it's not code. In some cases, you might be tempted to look at something like this bubblestat.phhtml and say, well, all the stuff that's getting passed to it is stuff that the coder's putting in. So I'm just not going to bother escaping it. Like there's not really a potential attack vector there. In general, to help other developers when they come along who might use your code in a way you didn't anticipate, and also to help anyone who's doing code review, so they're looking at your commits and trying to make sure there aren't security issues, we say just do the escaping for the context that you're in. Don't try to think about whether there's really a risk of the title and a bubble stat having a cross-site scripting vulnerability. It's not worth thinking about. It's not going to make the code faster in any significant way. Just put the escaping method in there. And that's all there is to it. Now, the partials work great when you're in a context like this, where I've got this chunk of markup. I don't want to just copy and paste it, because then if I change the way that markup works for whatever reason, I have to make sure I get it right in all three places. So the partial is perfect for that. I get to reuse that markup. The only things that vary are the things that actually have to vary. And in this particular instance, I don't really anticipate using these bubble stats anywhere else in the application. It's just on this page. So that's the perfect case for a partial. It's something I want to reuse, but I want to reuse it in a very limited context, either just on one page or on pages from one component in my application anyway. If I want to go beyond that, and I've got something that's going to be used throughout the app, and I really want like a nicer API for it, that's when a view helper comes into play. So first example is this section view helper. That is handling the wrapping markup here and the bottom part here. Now, there are a lot of view helpers built into Dewdrop to handle common cases, but right now we're going to look at custom view helpers in the context of ProntoSpot. So similarly to how we told Dewdrop about our custom admin layout by using the bootstrap, we're going to do the same thing with view helpers. So in pretty much any Dewdrop app, you're going to have this define view where we say, what does a view look like in this application? And one of the main things you might want to do there is set up some custom view helpers. So what you are allowed to do is say, whenever this name is used in a view script, I want it to call this class in my project. So whenever someone says section in a view script, it means this. Whenever someone says button, it means this. You can make this name anything, including one of the built-in Dewdrop view helpers. So in this case here, it's input text. I'm saying, actually, I want to use a bootstrap input when I'm doing input text on this project. And that way, when Dewdrop is doing some of its built-in stuff and it says, hey, I need a text input, it's going to get your particular one. In the case of ProntoSpot, this actually isn't going to be a bootstrap input text. We're going to do a UIKit input text. So we're going to tweak it a little bit. And this makes it very easy to do that. I can say, hey, everywhere in Dewdrop where and input text was being used, I'm going to use this class instead. So once you set up these assignments like this, you have to actually have the PHP class to handle it. And in most cases, the view helper classes are very simple. I mean, if you've done mostly front end work, it's a little weird to be writing a PHP class. You probably don't have to do it very often in front end work. But really, all it is kind of bundling up some of the stuff we already talked about. So view scripts and partials. In this case, my section view helper has two methods that can be called. You can either call open to start the section, or you can call close to end it. In the case of open, I want the faded portion of the title. So if we look at our DOM here, we have section title, there's a span, and there's a span with class bold. So that's what I'm representing here. What part is faded, what part's bolded. And then we've got some HTML for a button off to the side. So that's all this view helper is really asking for from the developer. Give me these three things and I'll give you the opening of a section. The partial is just like what we saw before. I'm even calling this view partial again. And then my HTML is just section open.phTML. And it's exactly what you'd expect. It's the start of the section. And depending upon what they passed in, I have a couple of if statements in here. So if I had a bolded title, then I'll put out that extra span. If they didn't give me one, or they gave me a blank one, I'll skip that part. And same thing for button HTML. If they didn't give me HTML for button over here on the right, I'm going to skip that part, but otherwise I'll output that. So that's opening it. And then the close, even simpler. This probably doesn't even need to be in a PHTML file, frankly, because it's so small. You probably just return the string. But that is this view helper. And let's look back at our index view script here to actually see that being used. So faded part of the title, bolded part of the title, and then HTML for a button, which is calling into another helper. Now this is subtle, but you can notice a difference here between these two. And the first one, first I'm saying, hey, give me the section view helper, and then call the open method on it. So there's kind of two steps to it. First, retrieve the helper, then call one of the methods on it. So that means retrieve this class, call this method. In the case of the button, on the other hand, we see that we're just passing an array of options directly to the button view helper. This is a shorthand for a case where your view helper only has one thing to be called. So there's not an open and a close, there's just one thing to call. And here's what that looks like. You implement a method called direct. So the direct method is the thing that will be called if you just call the helper itself. You don't call a method after it. And in this case, because there are a few different things that could be involved, many options that could be involved, I pass them in as an array. Now, of course, you can just go straight from that array to your partial. You don't have to do this step that I'm about to show you, but it can be pretty helpful for the developers. And that's this prepare options array concept. And essentially, this is just a couple of little helper methods that are built into the Dewdrop views, where you can say, hey, when someone gives me an options array, it has to have a title property in it. I need that for my helper. If they don't have that, this will throw an error. So it'll say, hey, you didn't pass me the required title parameter. Then I can say, I want these things to be present. So I want to be able to assume on line 21 here that there's an ID inside of options. It can be blank. The developer doesn't have to tell me one, but I want in my code and the view helper to be able to assume that it's there. So that's what ensure present does. It says, make sure these are present in the options array. They don't have to have a value, but they should be there. And then finally, ensure that this one, the classes portion, is an array, because I'm going to assume it's an array in my view script. So the view script in this case, we see is rendering a button tag, and it's imploding the classes into a string. So that's why we want them to be an array, because otherwise you get an error right there. And it's putting the values for the other options in the appropriate places. So if they told me an icon, then I'll go ahead and put an icon tag in there with the appropriate class. So that's an example of a view helper where I only have the single method. So I implement that with a direct. So again, looking at it from the other direction, opening a section, putting a button in place. Two different ways to call it. Just a slightly shorter way when you only have one method, and it makes it clear to the user there's nothing else to be called there. So that's view helpers. These are obviously very simple view helpers. So I want to show a couple examples from Dewdrop itself, so you get a feel for what a more complicated one might look like. One thing that's worth noting is, in certain cases, you might be doing your HTML, or sorry, your CSS and JavaScript in a view helper. So that would basically be saying anytime someone chooses to use a section, I need to include this extra CSS because I've got special section CSS. And that way the developer doesn't have to think, well, I'm using a section here. Do I need to include another file? That's all embedded in the view helper. It happens automatically from their perspective. So this is the Summer Note rich text editor. So kind of like the WYSIWYG editor in WordPress. And whenever I use this on a field, it automatically is going to pull in these two CSS files and this one JavaScript file. I don't have to think about it. And then ultimately, it is just rendering a text area on top of that. So it's a text area with the class of Summer Note on it. That's the only markup that gets drawn. So this is a fairly simple one from a PHP standpoint. You know, add CSS, add JavaScript, render a text area. There are others, though, where you'll see this in, again, just some Dewdrop core stuff, where depending upon which types of arguments someone gives you, you're going to use a different method for handling it. So in the case of a form view helper in Dewdrop, if they give me this set of arguments, I will render this way. If they give me a different set of arguments, I will render another way. So it's a way to give the developers convenience functions. So if they happen to have a fields object around, they can pass that and their input filter, and this will handle the rest. If they don't have that, they could directly call this open method and specify manually all of these different things. So you'll see that in some of the built-in view helpers. And a lot of cases, you can trace that down to like a root rendering method, and you don't have to worry too much about that end direction. So let's look at input text here. So again, we're saying, okay, depending upon the arguments, we're going to use different methods. And in this case, if they gave me a field, I'm going to call this. If they gave me just a name and a value, I'm going to call this. If they gave me an array, I'm going to call this. But ultimately, you can see that the field version is calling direct array, and the explicit version is also calling direct array. So all of the rendering ultimately goes through this call. So there's a single partial that's used for input text. The other types of arguments are just ways of setting defaults. So if they gave me a field object, I can automatically figure out the name and the ID and the value because that'll come from the field. So that's just a shortcut. You know, from a front-end developer's perspective, it's all about input text.html. That's where everything lives. So that's something to keep in mind if you're ever looking at the core Dewdrop stuff. I don't know that you would need to necessarily, but that's a concept that you would encounter if you looked there. Um, I think that's pretty much it. Any questions or things you would like to see a demo or example of?
Um, not that I can think of, but it's all pretty helpful.
Cool.
Even just looking into the core Dewdrop stuff.
Awesome. So
Yeah,
I've been recording this.
it's.
And I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jared.
I was just gonna say it's really cool to see how far it's come from the first time I think I did a project in it. But yeah, good job.
Cool. Um, I'll throw this video up on YouTube. I know Kaylee wanted to check it out, and she said she might write up a tutorial based on it. Um, but also, I guess this will just be around for reference if you need to freshen up a little bit on any of it. If you guys ever have questions about how to get some HTML to be spit out to the browser via Dewdrop, just let me know. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, like I said, the whole philosophy of the way that we do the rendering in Dewdrop is that ultimately the front end developer should be able to just write HTML if that's what they want to do. They can use all these built-in conveniences, but it should just be an HTML file when it comes down to it. So yeah, I think that's it. Like I said, this will go on YouTube, and if you have questions, let me know.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Brett.